Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on with our casual chat and discussion of the films that make up the great horror series known as Friday the 13th. And it's been my great pleasure and honor to share with you some of my experiences with the film and my comments about some of the films in past videos. And today I'd like to focus, if I may, on this film, which is Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, John Carl Buechler's film from 1988. What an interesting film this is. So just please note that this is not meant to be a review of the film, but it's just meant to maybe allow me to share with you some experiences I have with this. And also I will be speaking about specific spoilers. So anyway, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Again, this came in the late 80s. And by this time, by the time the film was released, I had already begun to watch and explore the Friday the 13th films, as I had mentioned in past videos. I should say, too, that I remember around this time, I was beginning to become aware of horror magazines and especially magazines like Fangoria. And this was a time where you could still get Fangoria magazine in an ordinary magazine shop or bookstore or seller of that sort. You could just go into a store and get Fangoria magazine for however much it was. It wasn't that expensive. So this was a great time, and this was before the internet, and so these magazines were the world for people like me growing up in the 80s who loved this stuff. And I remember that there was that period of Fangoria magazine publication, as far as I can recall. I'm not a Fangoria magazine expert or historian, but based on my own memory and recollection, I do recall that period where we did see a lot of coverage of Friday the 13th films. In particular, I do seem to recall the coverage that was given to Part 7, The New Blood, and the makeup effects and the way that Jason himself was portrayed, not just in terms of the mask, but also in terms of the body damage that we see. We see some bones as well, and that was a big deal at the time. This was to show the extent of all the damage that had accumulated over the years and over the films to Jason's body. And we actually see the after effects of that. Also, this is very, so I remember the film, and I associate it so much with Fangoria magazine. And some of the makeup effects, especially the Jason-related makeup effects here, are so well done. And they are so classic now, so iconic now in the Friday the 13th lore. There's the moment, of course, at the end, the big climax between Tina and Jason, where Tina is able to use her psychic abilities to break the mask off of Jason, the unmasking, which is one of the coolest unmaskings of any Friday the 13th film, I think. The way that it just shatters the mask, and then the whole thing with the wire from the ceiling, and oh my goodness, very cool stuff. But yes, so the Jason-related makeup, in particular, I think is one of the standouts of this film. There was a lot of mention made, I remember at the time, the fact that John Carl Buechler was helming this as the director, and so we understand his background in makeup effects. And so there was this notion of this potentially being a very makeup-heavy film. And indeed, I think it can be said that with regard to Jason anyway, we do get a lot of the great gusto and the great verve that is the glory of the makeup effects, especially during the 80s. And there's some really cool things that are going on here. And it's also helped, of course, by the great Jason performance by Kane Hodder. Wow. I mean, the way that he moves his body and the way we see him breathing, almost out of frustration. He's being worked up and just worked up to a kill. And so I love the way that we see his hulking shoulders move up and down, and we can sense the frustration and the venom that must exist in the Jason character at this moment. All the stuff that's happened to him over however many years uh, and then to come back to life through this psychic power by this random kid, and it boggles the mind. So if I were Jason, I'd also be like, what the heck is going on? And so there's a sense of frustration in the body language I think is so great. But I think those are a couple examples of why I think this is a real great one. This is one of my favorites in the later period. From part 5 onwards, or part 6 onwards. I love it too because it does have a Friday the 13th, the final chapter vibe. If we recall the final chapter, let's take a step back. Each of the early Friday the 13th films has a slightly different situation about it, right? So Friday the 13th, the first one had the preparation for the Camp Crystal Lake. And then part 2 was several years later after the events of the first Friday, and then it was situated in another part, also on the lake, but it was a house that was meant to be a training facility for camp counselors. So it wasn't a camp per se. And then the third film was this essentially a lake house. And then the fourth film was yet another house neighboring another house. And so we had 2 houses neighboring each other. And here in Friday the 13th, Part 7, we have a similar situation to that which we saw in the final chapter. Namely, we have these 2 neighboring houses, and we have one house and the other house, and the party with the kids, and also the situation involving Tina and her mother and the doctor. And so I like this division of narrative responsibility, very much akin to what we saw in the final chapter. And indeed, there are other links to the early Friday the 13th cycle, in my opinion, all the way down to the way that we get a lot of nighttime scenes in the woods, running through the woods, running into empty sheds that very conveniently have all these like garden utensils and sharp objects that Jason can essentially take off the wall and use at will, which I think is a very interesting and cool thing. And we also have lakes, and we have that sense of the outdoors at night, which is very much part of the spirit, I think, of the early series. We did see it, of course, in films like, we did see it in Part 6, I think very much so, but there's a continuation of that atmosphere, I think, in Part 7 that I find very effective. Also, the way that Part 7 ends, with the ambulance, and it's very much similar to the way that Part 2 ends, except whereas Part 2 might be said to be an ambiguous ending, what happens to Paul, etc. In Part 7, it's more of a happy ending. We know what happens to the characters. They essentially drive off to what we assume could be living happily ever after. So it's driving off in one film and also in this film, but unlike Part 2, here we get a more optimistic ending. But still, it is a link to the past, which I really admire very much. Then we should go to what are, I think, some of the interesting aspects, and I think the often discussed aspects of the film, as far as I understand it, which is the relatively low degree of on-screen violence and makeup special effects violence that's shown. We do get a little bit of the blood and the special effects, but oftentimes it's cut away, or the film cuts away before we actually see the violence. This is sometimes considered to be, maybe by some, I understand, to be not as consistent as the type of effects work that we might come to expect from a Friday the 13th film. And we do understand that a lot of those decisions were not on purpose, but rather on the part of the filmmakers, but rather it might have had to do with trying to get a particular rating for the film, and so to tone down the violence was part of that objective. And so there probably was there was more violence planned, as far as we understand it, but it just ended up not being part of the final theatrical cut of the film. So we understand that the amount of violence that's actually shown in the mode of special effects is maybe relatively little compared to that from other films. But I think at the same time, I think a number of things are in the film's favor related to this particular component. So first is, I think the film does a really admirable job of generating a lot of suspense and tension. It feels, there are some comic overtones, but there's also a lot of dread and suspense. And I think that is a nice contrast with a film like, say, Jason Lives, which was the immediately preceding film. Don't get me wrong, I really admire and love Jason Lives, but I think Jason Lives had a level of suspense that I think is more prevalent as far as my own viewing in Part 7. And so there is that extra added dimension of dread, which I think is also in keeping with some of the earlier Friday the 13th films, which I really appreciate. Also, even in some of the early films, say even Part 1 or, I don't know, Part 2, maybe more Part 5 perhaps, there was this way, let's take Part 5 as an example, and this might be, I mean, I'm using Part 5, but even Part 5, I've mentioned how much I love Part 5, and one of the things that's so interesting about Part 5 is, if you really look at it, at least the final cut version, regardless of what might have been initially planned as far as the on-screen, let's say, violence and sex that's portrayed in that film, even in Part 5, we get the way that violence is depicted. We get the close-up of the scream, or we get the close-up of the victim, but we never see, for the most part, and we never see the actual impact of the implement or the weapon on the physical body. We never see the actual damage as expressed in a special effects makeup appliance. We might see the aftermath, but we never see it actually going on. Sometimes we do, but other times we don't. And I think those times that we don't is very much similar to the way that violence is depicted in Part 7. And also, too, we have to remember the Tom Savini philosophy of this kind of on-screen violence. We have to show just enough to know what's going on, but then cut away at just the right time, so to let it linger, but also to not draw attention to the fact that we are seeing a special effect. So even in the Tom Savini makeup effects of, say, Part 1 and Part 4, there was this notion of showing a little bit, but not showing too much. And so it does feel like even in those films, the camera cuts away more than we might expect. And so this idea of showing little in terms of on-screen violence is not inconsistent in the world of Friday the 13th, in my view. And so this film and how it displays violence is not inconsistent. And in fact, I think it's in fact very consistent with what we've seen. Now, is it what people might prefer? Again, some of the appeal, as I know, is to see the special effects makeup work. And especially considering the fact that we understand that a lot of makeup effects had been planned but ended up not being included in the final film, makes this film, I think, another one of those what-if scenarios in cinema. You know, what if this film had been released with all those special effects scenes intact? What would have happened? But what we get now is, I think, not just serviceable, but also very effective. And it is perhaps even more consistent with the world of Friday the 13th than meets the eye. The other thing, too, which is, again, one of the fascinating things about this film, is how different it is in terms of the Tina character. Right? And we know this because this is the first time, I think, in the Friday the 13th universe where we're getting a character with psychic powers that is able to use her psychic abilities to fight Jason. Now, we've seen a number of people in the Friday the 13th universe fight Jason. I think most memorably, we've seen the Tommy Jarvises of the world do battle quite successfully against Jason. But here we're getting someone who has psychic abilities, which is, one way to describe it, and I think it's been described in some of the interviews that we see in the special features, which is Carrie meets Jason. So Carrie referring to the character of Carrie, the Stephen King novel, and then the Brian De Palma film, Carrie. the young teenage girl with the powers of telekinesis. And so we have Carrie versus Jason, which is, I think, a great example of how, in particular, the later period Jason films, from Jason Lives onwards, I would suggest each is trying to do its own thing, trying to put its spin, its unique spin, on the Jason film or the Friday the 13th film. So in part 6 we had, I would suggest, this way of turning it into almost like a comic book action-adventure film. That is also a horror film, but it also has this action-adventure element to it. Then in part 7, this film, the introduction of Tina with psychic abilities, that is attacking Jason. And those set pieces, by the way, are so cool. Like when Jason is on the porch or on the outside the house, and suddenly the house collapses on him. It's just, oh my goodness, what's going on? And he's like, what's going on? Why is all this thing, all this this wood moving of its own accord? I don't understand. And I love that body language. That is just so cool. And it just continues on. Of course, there is that weird thing about, who is that guy at the end, right? Coming out of nowhere, grabbing Jason, right? We understand, of course, that it's meant to be the father figure, Tina's father, and we understand that there's a very complex relationship between Tina and her parents, in particular her father, which starts the Tina storyline at the beginning, and we have this very interesting resolution at the end. It's one of the things, so who is this guy? What's going on? But then that's Tina's father. Okay, that's an interesting way to take care of the Jason character at the end. Okay. It could be also to be, in many ways, a sort of mirroring of the parent-children relationships that we see expressed in Friday the 13th films, a la Lakes, right? I mean, we've seen Jason come out of the water. We've seen Jason's mother come out of the water. We've seen Jason come out of the water in part 1. We've seen Jason's mother I think it's his mother, right, coming out of the water in part 3, not decapitated, but with worms and things coming out of the water. And then now we have Tina's father coming out of the water. So parent-children relationships as expressed through the lake and coming out of the depths to save the day. So it's an interesting turn on that parent-child dynamic, I suppose. But it still begs the question, right? I mean, every time I see this film, I always have to remind myself, like, who is this guy? What? Oh yeah, it's okay. All right, okay, that's interesting. Oh, and then the film ends. Very interesting. So that's an example of how this film is trying to do its own thing, right? To employ this psychic power plot as a means to battle Jason. It's cool. It might be seen as being derivative of other films. Okay, but still, it's cool. It's very cool, and you get these great moments of you get these little hints along the way, with the pearls and great, like, Tina, like, really acting it out, really going for it, and it pays dividends because she is able to defeat Jason in ways that he is not expecting. So it's the way that this film is trying to be its own unique thing. And we will see other films in the rest of the series, I would suggest, trying to do its own unique take on the Jason story. So we'll see that, of course, in the next film, Jason Takes Manhattan, where you have a whole different setting. And then the next film after that, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, is a complete retelling of the Jason myth. And then we have Jason X as well, which is a totally new setting. But anyway, this is an example of that retelling or putting a new spin on the storyline. And so I admire that approach very much. It keeps the proceedings fresh. Again, would it be for everyone? Probably not. And there's no reason to expect this film to be to everyone's liking. And so perhaps some people who are Friday fans like this film, maybe others are less than enthusiastic. But wherever one falls, I think one can no doubt still agree that this is still trying to do something different. with the Tina character and the whole psychic power battle, which is ultimately very effective, as we see, because it is able to take care of, or it's able to enable the father to come back and take care of Jason. This is an interesting one. It's one of my favorites from the later period, and it's probably the last time in this early cycle of films, before we get into the real modern period, of course, it's probably the last time we'll see the use of the camp or the use of the woods and the lakeside treated in this capacity, before we get into various reworkings of the environment and the geography, starting with the next film and the film after that. So we're getting a sort of final hurrah, as it were, in this mode of environment. We'll, of course, see it again in very recent modern takes of the Friday the 13th myth, in films like the remake and also Freddy vs. Jason. But in this initial run of the 80s, this is one of the final hurrahs, I would say. And also there are some very memorable scenes. I think probably the one that stands out for a lot of people is the sleeping bag scene. Wow. Wow. That there's something to be said about the use of sleeping bags in horror films. I don't know if you know the film. Do you know the film Prophecy? That's another sleeping bag horror film moment that is so memorable. Oh, so Prophecy and Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. My goodness, wow. But in any event, my friends, there's a lot here that I think is memorable and unique and twisted, and also calling back to some iconic moments from the early cycle of films, and also trying to forge its own path going forward. It would have been interesting to see maybe what could have been done with Tina and Jason going forward. As with any hero in these films, we had, for example, the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. It would have been interesting maybe to see what they could have done with the Tina character, maybe a Tina trilogy, I don't know. And Jason always coming back, and maybe maybe she teams up with her dad and they fight Jason. Maybe she teams up with her dad and her powers accidentally bring back not just Jason but Jason's mom, and so Tina and her dad fight Jason and his mom. Wow, that would have been a cool epic battle. But anyway, this is Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Okay, my friends, so thank you very much for your time. I very much appreciate it. And please continue to be happy and healthy and well. And please also just stay safe during these times. Of course, we know that these times are very stressful and very hectic, and they continue to be so, unfortunately. But whatever the case may be for you, wherever you are in the world, please continue to stay strong and stay safe, and take care of your family and friends and loved ones. And once you have taken care of that, my friends, keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, thank you and cheers.